Hello. We are here for episode number 2. Now, I need to give a brief disclaimer. I'm new to this. It's something to get used to, putting yourself in front of a camera. And unfortunately, we don't have a guest for me to converse with, so I will regale you with more tales and reflections from my own experience. Thank you for joining me. This is the Heart Journey Home podcast. That name first came to me when I was chatting to a friend of mine. We would catch up quite a bit. We'd talk about spiritual life, what our challenges were, what we were, learning at the time. And I asked him, what is it that we do here? Like, how would you describe it to someone who's not met me? And he said, oh, well, we seem to go round in circles, always getting closer and closer to the heart of the matter. And I thought, that's not a bad description. There's a power in conversation. It's you ever have those conversations where it really engages you. The person you're talking to, you're on the same wavelength. You're a little bit excited to have found someone that you can be open with. And there's a spontaneous flow of insight and confession that goes on as you're talking to someone that you trust, and you find yourself, as it were, journeying together, walking alongside one another, companions on this life journey. And obviously you're not going to stay together forever. Eventually you have lunch, there's work, people have other things they need to be doing, but for that brief period your paths converge and then they diverge again. And these companionships, the conversations that happen there, are edifying. They build you up. They stir things in you. And perhaps you find yourself sharing things that you hadn't even thought about in that depth before. But there's something about this other person and the questions they're raising, and you're attempting to explain things on the fly. It's almost like you're thinking together as a collaborative exercise. You're reflecting together. You're putting your minds together to compute these things with greater computing power than you had on your own. In such conversations, something emerges that's greater than the sum of both persons. There's a wisdom that emerges, a revelation that occurs out of the space between the two of you. It raises a lot of fascinating questions. For example, what is a relationship? We talk about it as though it's a thing. It has a character of its own. There's something about two people in connection, engaging with one another over a period of time, where something of each of you gets shared in the space between you, in the gap. And as you continue getting to know each other and spending quality time together, that space, it takes on characteristics. It needs maintaining. It is sensitive to what each person contributes. This is true in friendships, of course, but it's also true in romantic relationships. One of the more fascinating concepts that I came across was a book by Rob Bell called The Tzimtzum of Love. Now, if you've not heard of this term, Tzimtzum, it actually goes back to the Hebrew culture. It's this fascinating dynamic that gets described in the Kabbalah, or the ancient Hebrew wisdom literature. Wisdom, what would you say? Tradition is probably more accurate. Now, this Tzimtzum, spelt T-Z, not with a silent T, basically, Tzimtzum, It describes this interesting balance between presence and absence. So I'll describe this the way that the Kabbalah describes it. It's like God is all-powerful and omnipresent, and he's a large, big, powerful God, right? But in order to create humanity, in order to create the world, in a way, he had to withdraw from a space, kind of withdraw into himself to allow space where someone else could exist, someone else's will, someone else to exist apart from him. Now, this might be a strange concept for some people. If you're grown up in Christianity, or you maybe are new to religion, these sorts of abstract ideas can be hard to kind of wrap your head around. They might seem complicated or vague and difficult to interact with. But over the course of centuries, millennia, these ideas form kind of the fundamental underlying conceptual structure for further development of thought and understanding. These are the fundamentals. These notions of cosmology, of origin, they're metaphors in a way. They describe a hypothesis to how the world began and the dynamics involved. But that's not their primary purpose. It's not a scientific thesis. It's not a scientific proposal. Science didn't exist in the form it is now until quite recently in human history. Back then, it's more like it served as kind of a framing device. If this is how we imagine the world first began, then that sets up our expectations for how the world continues to function and exist. It's not something that we should dismiss out of hand just because, we believe in science now, we don't need all of those things. It's like, no. Science is attempting to do one thing, but this is trying to do something else. This is trying to not trace back the material world necessarily. That's not terribly important to people who lived 5,000 years ago, let's say. The more important thing is, how do we live in a world that seems to reflect some underlying structure? Human beings themselves follow a pattern. And if we can understand what that pattern is, then we can better engage in the world. We can more successfully and effectively engage with one another. That's more the purpose of these ideas. Not to say at the same time true, because the focus is something quintessentially right and true about these reflections. They reflect a world in which, if you believe these things and you approach life from that perspective, it works out better. Now, I'm sort of meandering a little bit. Let's backtrack. The Tzimtzum of God. In order for the world to exist, God had to withdraw some of his absolute presence in order for there to be space where something other than him could exist. This is an accommodation that God made to the world. But an accommodation we make to one another. If you are too close with someone, a kind of enmeshment develops, a kind of codependence. If a parent encroaches too much on their child, it becomes invasive. The child actually can't develop their own individuality, their own inner sense of ability, and as they develop, their sense of identity enmeshed with their parent, and they actually feel tremendous anxiety when the parent isn't there, or when they encounter things that they could do on their own, but the parent had always done for them. A parent like this, who rushes in to save their child from all difficulties, who's always there in this codependent fashion, in anxious attachment in the child. Now, you may have heard of this thing called attachment. It's a theory in psychology and psychotherapy that has emerged over the last 50 to 100 years to describe relationships, this space between people. We'll get back into the specifics of that. Let's stick with now. You can be too close to someone, and it's stifling, it's exhausting to have this person always there. You can't develop as an individual. But what about if that person is too far? You might feel abandoned. You might feel outside of connection. You might feel rejected. You might feel like you don't have support when you need it. Children who grow up in that kind of environment, where if they call on a parent for support, for emotional regulation, and the parent does not show up, they develop what we call avoidant attachment. Now, it's not that they no longer have needs, that they, that for emotional closeness and connection and encouragement and all that sort of thing. Avoidant attachment is where the child experiences the lack of support so frequently that they no longer believe that support would come. And so their body develops a very helpful coping strategy, which is their sensitivity to the lack of connection gets turned down. Now they're not even conscious of it. In fact, they feel connection is actually scary. It's threatening. I'm not familiar with this thing. I don't trust it. That's avoidant attachment. But it's also reflected in this fascinating dynamic of God's omnipresence, closeness, immanence on the one hand, and God's transcendence, his mystery on the other. It's almost as though God occupies this space where when we cry out to him for help and support, he's only a breath away. And yet, he's removed enough that we're free to live our own way, to ignore God if we choose to make our own decisions and to test our own abilities, to survive, to succeed or fail based on our own strengths. In this way, God represents the ideal attachment figure, present when he's needed, and at a safe distance when he's not. This has, over the years, been a fundamental aspect of child development. We need a parent who is there when we need them, but able to give us our space. If we have that, we can develop in what I think it was Vygotsky talked about, the zone of proximal development. It's like this ideal space of relationship where you can encounter the difficulties of life, but you're not left alone without support. In the attachment model, it's this notion of going out into the world And when you're tired or you're distressed, when you're hurt, when you're sick, when you're tired, you have a relationship, trustworthy relationship that you can run back to. So there's this movement like the tide. There's a going out and there's a coming back. There's a presence and there's a launching pad out away from that presence. But in that zone, in that space of relationship, it's almost like if you learn to trust that relationship in the course of growing up, it becomes internalized. You don't need the person with you for you to know they are there in spirit. That secure attachment figure who accommodates you when you stumble, when you're overcome with self-doubt and difficulty and hurt and all those sort of disempowering messages flood your mind, like I can't do this, or that person hurt me, or the world's against me. No, you've got this relationship that at one time existed between you and the other person. But then at a later point, it's almost like the relationship has moved inside of you and you take it with you. Now, why all this talk about Tzimtzum? This notion that God is present and absent at the same time. That he's always watching, but not always directly involved. This brings me to a story. This brings me back to my story, in fact. I think when I first discovered that God could play an active role in my life, that I prayed about things, I wrestled with things, I'd go out to lonely places and I'd pray and I'd monologue for at least an hour. Like, you only got so much stamina to do this, right? I'd wrestle with God. I'd vent my frustrations, my difficulties, my hopes, my fears, everything that came to mind. I would pour that into the relational space between me and God. And for a long time, I just had to accept that God had big shoulders. He could handle that stuff, but he was also the strong silent type. But something else started happening as well. It's as though, well, first I felt lighter having emptied myself of all of these things with God. It's like he became the person who I could go to. He was a reliable, earned, secure attachment figure. I trusted that when I make these, let's say, confessions, not of all the bad things I've done necessarily, but just fessing up to how I am at the moment, what I'm thinking, how I'm wrestling with, why I feel challenged, all that confusion things, that's a kind of fessing up. So when I would fess up where I'm at, and I'd pour all this stuff out, first, I felt lighter walking away, exhausted, but just a week or so. But then something else started happening. I'd notice changes in my circumstances. And it overt answer to prayer necessarily, but it's almost like subtle hints that, oh, my story is making progress. Now, after a while, I developed these gifts for intellect and study and learning and ideas, and my journey began gaining some momentum. But after a while, how do I put this? That intellect and that religiosity and that, charging after God, on the one hand, it felt heroic. It felt like I was on this adventure. I was learning things, and I was meeting people, and my story was making progress. But there was something else there, something that I didn't realize until much, much later, years later, in fact. And that is that intellect was saddled by some kind of insecurity, some kind of desperation. If I stopped seeking God, or I wasn't progress, I'd feel distressed. I'd feel like part of me was suffocating. I needed to continue pressing on. I had to continue learning. I was being motivated. That intellect was being motivated by something anxious. And so years into that leg of my journey, preaching at churches and sharing talks and lessons and at my youth group, and getting involved in things and meeting people. It was a whole thing. Season, it was several years. I realized that there was this desperate seeking for God, for his presence, not just participating in the book club, but actually wanting to know them. And that was a thing that the church I grew up in didn't really accommodate. Some church traditions actually go way back, or more, ending with the real and felt presence of God. Participating in practices that position a person to really let that in. Grew up in was not one of those. It was kind of trial and error. You're on your own with that stuff. We'll teach you doctrines. What does the Bible say about this topic and that topic and that topic? But for me, my journey was not focused on the doctrines. It was focused on I'm on this desperate quest to know by God. It's fundamental reality of human experience. Now, my partner, we'd been getting into all kinds of events all the time. Quite frequently, actually, superficially, but they always reflect that neither of us were fully. And I remember we were having one argument, and in the midst of it, she has this sudden real. She looks at me and she says, "You're not angry with me. You're angry with God." And I took a step back because I'm thinking, that doesn't make any sense at all. Firstly, we're not talking about God. We're talking about these things. But secondly, I love God. I'm seeking God. I desire God. How can you say I'm angry with God? But here's the thing. I love that moment. Usually pretty clued in on these sorts of things. Had proven to me before that she could see things, I could see them. So I thought, okay, I'm going to withdraw. I'm going to reflect on this. I'm going to delve into this. And what I started realizing was, I'm angry with God. I'm angry with God for not meeting me, driving up. And as I did on it more, I realized that impulse to chase after God was actually moved to me by other relationships. It's almost as though humans have finite relational templates, from our parents to us and all those experiences. When we have a new relationship, we can only use the models of relationship that we've learned before. And for the relationship I have with God, I only do the relationship of God's not here, I need to chase after. But after years of chasing, I still didn't feel a satisfaction for that sense of lack. Now, it's on one level, yeah, I trusted God was present. When I went out and prayed, when I wrestled with him, I always believed inextricably, I trusted that God was listening, that he was compassionate by nature, that he was good by definition. But on this other level, and he was always ahead of me, and I'd never reached him. It's like, there's a part of me that was at that now. It's a blind spot. I didn't realize it. I had an anxious attachment to God, driven by an unchecked belief, unconscious belief, that God was absent. So if you believe that God is absent, that God is somewhere else, oh, I know how to solve that problem. I'll chase after God. I'll learn all these things. I'll get involved in these groups. I'll talk to people. I'll pray. I'll wrestle. And to some extent, that does bring you closer to God. But it doesn't solve the original belief that stays with you in the midst. God is not present. God is not present. God is not present. Years of chasing after God, and there, regardless of what's changed. And so the anxiety to close that gap, stayed as well. Needless to say, I spent some time wrestling with, delving deeper and deeper into where it came from and who do I need to forgive who taught me that dynamic. How do I let this dynamic go? How do I repent, in a way, of this belief that's unconscious, doesn't reflect how things are now, but only reflects a repeated wound that I sustained earlier in life, relationships. So I did that. Took about a week to kind of figure some of this out. And then a remarkable thing happened. When I released these people from my expectation that was disappointed, from my history of chasing what I'd never have, I experienced this amazing, overwhelming relief and joy, because the belief that God is not present was no longer standing in the way of me experiencing God's presence now. These are complicated psychological ideas. But it was like there was this deep belief inhabiting a wound, and if you address those things, it's almost like you can continue a more wholesome trajectory of growth, as if that wound never occurred, as if you never had those obstacles. You could continue and start living at a different level. Now, it was fascinating. As time went on, I started developing notions. I started doing research, and I'm thinking, okay, God is present at present. God is present at present, presently. I may not feel it. I may not remember it a lot of the time, but when we pray, we're not asking God to leave wherever he is now and come to where we are. That's an old idea. It's an assumption that we have, that God is not present right now. Let's pray and ask God to be with us. Not quite. The way that the Bible seems to describe it is God is always with us. Nothing can separate us from him. God is present. He is with us, especially in our distress. He wants it to be clear. He is with us. The Holy Spirit is described as the presence of God that is closer than our breath. We don't always experience it. So what changes when we pray? What changes when we allow ourselves to become vulnerable to that presence? It's not that God suddenly shows up. It's that we do. We go about our lives in this kind of absent-minded way. We get distracted with things that need doing, our own agendas. We fortify ourselves against various difficulties that may emerge, and against, emotional attacks and abrasions from just life in general. And if God's always with us, we don't need to do anything to close that gap. God is already here, available for us, within reach to support us if we reach back to him. If we want him to be there, he's there in a moment. If we need some space, he gives us. But we are the show up. We are the ones who decide, okay, God, I'm going to make myself vulnerable to your presence. I'm going to accept, I'm going to surrender this striving and this chasing and this active, implicit denial that you're actually here with me now, that there's nothing I need to do to work for it, that it's already here by default. That's not something we aim to strive for. It's something we acquiesce to. We fall back to it. We surrender our own agendas for striving and earning and fixing, and instead we fall back and accept, okay, God, this is what's been. It may have been outside my awareness, but that doesn't mean it wasn't the true thing. This is one of the insistences of Scripture, that God exists ahead of us in terms of what he's calling us to, but he's also journeying with us on the road. He has our back, he walks with us, he's present. And a lot of the time we don't experience that presence because we're in our heads, because we're striving, because we've resolved within ourselves, no, I know the answer. I'm going to move forward in my own assumptions about what is. And God says, okay, this story that you're a victim is not a story I want to be a part of. I don't agree with that story. This story that you've been abandoned and it's because of your own striving that you're journeying with God and making this progress and you'll catch up with God eventually. I don't know if I agree with that story. So I'm not going to be found in it. What I had to realize in the space of my own journey, in my own experience, in my own understanding, it could have been read to me. Someone could have told me. It wouldn't have necessarily had the same impact because there's a distance between understanding something in theory, understanding it in your head, and realizing it and knowing it in your heart. So I had this experience and I started realizing, oh, I've been chasing after God, but he's not been running. I thought I was chasing after God. What if I was running away from God? Running away from vulnerability, running away from being present. And if I stop running, I'll find that God was right behind me all the time. I just need to turn around. This notion of God's presence, when I think about all I know about counseling and therapy and healing and growth, is fundamental. Because just like the natural environment of the human person is relationship. It's where we develop. It's if you find yourself outside of secure attachment and relationship and tribe, your development as a person, your brain development, becomes skewed. You develop gaps in your development. You incur traumas just from everyday life that set up blocks in your potential. We belong in connection. And that's our natural state with God as well. God is always with us. I will never leave you or forsake you. I am with you to the very ends of the earth. He says, this is the truth. Believe me. God has a lot of things to say that we hear in our minds and we say, oh, yes, that's true. We believe it, we assert it. But have we made ourselves vulnerable to it? Often when we take knowledge, and I feel like I've earned enough by my intellect to share this notion. It's like you can gather knowledge in your head, but the mind obeys different rules to that of the heart. And when you read about the heart in the Bible, that is the place where our deepest knowing and thinking and being originates from. If you're more of a modern thinker, you could consider it as the deep unconscious, primarily associated with the functions of the right hemisphere of the brain, but also intricately connected with neurons that are in the heart. And that's because the heart is a part of the body. The mind is somewhat detached from the present moment. We can project into the future, we can remember the past, we can disappear into our own fantasies and thought life. That's something that exists inside of us. But the heart occupies the present. The heart occupies the present moment where physical sensations exist, where relationships occur, where we're in touch with reality in a way that the mind has to interpret things. Now, if you want to explore this in greater depth, it's what I call the gap between ontology and epistemology. Ontology is the study of what is real. Epistemology is our study of our understanding of what's real. The map is not the territory. My understanding might be one thing, but the reality itself is very different from how I engage with the world. I experienced this most a year or so ago from this recording when I started doing my counseling placement for the first time. I was sitting with my first client. I'd just done like 4 years of study, and I knew all the things. You know, if you asked me, I could give a lecture on any aspect of counseling and different models and interventions and psychology and human development and all that sort of thing. But when I sat with my first client, I had this realization: oh, I don't know what I'm doing. It's as though being in the present, in relationship, occupies a different part of the brain to I know all these things. And it actually takes some time of being with this other person for your knowledge brain and your being brain to start syncing up and making connections and, oh, I do remember something I can do here. But leading with being is not something that many of us learn. We lead with doing. So if you think of it like the mind and the heart, let's say, the mind and the heart. The mind is and is the place of intellectual understanding, mental projection, calculating things, labeling things, being specific, logical. But the heart is the place of the present, of engaging with people in the moment. When you get out onto stage, you can't stay in your own head or you'll stop engaging with the audience. It's a similar thing. If I was in my head, I couldn't engage with my client. I had to be in the moment. But then all this intellect that I'd learned in that part of the brain, it wasn't in my heart. If we think of the head and the heart in terms of attachment theory, anxious attachment is where the anxieties and trauma in our own hearts, that sense of lack and loss and aloneness, it floods our mind, and all of a sudden we're thinking things that are anxious. We don't often think about our thoughts having attitude and emotions. But if my heart is flooding my mind, that's part of how attachment theory describes anxious attachment. Likewise, if the mind senses the heart, I'm not a heart person. I'm totally in my head and thinking logically, and I can't even locate my heart if you ask me about it. That's something more like avoidant attachment. Your sensitivity to the heart has been turned way down, and you're not even aware of it, right? Secure attachment is something like an alignment, a proper alignment and coordination between the head and the heart, where they're cooperating. Both hemispheres of your brain are integrated, connected. You're benefiting from the focused and specific resources of the mind and the vast, intuitive, megalithic processing power of the heart. Both of those are in tandem. It's actually when we feel most grounded. It's actually when we feel most relatable to other people. It's actually when you have the most charisma, when you feel most secure and comfortable in your own skin, when you're in the moment, but you're bringing the best of yourself to that interaction. That is when you are aligned. When you're occupying a security that can't always come from yourself. It has to first be learned from someone else, from an attachment figure you've had growing up, or the ultimate earned attachment figure of God. Now, not everyone experiences God as secure and trustworthy and someone you want to run to when you're distressed. Some people experience God as distressing, as someone whose presence conjures anxiety and stage fright and, oh no, I might be judged. I would argue that that person's attachment to God is being informed by their learned attachment to other people. There are two kinds of attachment to God. One is where we see God as an earned, secure attachment figure. He's making up for the deficits that were left by our other relationships. He is the ideal by definition. So whatever that ideal is, God is going to be consistent with it because it's his relationship with us that rehabilitates us out of insecurity and into our most authentic selves. But there's another kind of attachment to God as well. Attachment that coincides with our relationship with a parent or a teacher or multiple persons we've known over the course of our early life. We project that same dynamic onto God. So if we had attachment figures, if we lived in a grown-up world that was harsh, condemning, pointing out all the things we've done wrong, and then you learn about religion, assuming that your church didn't intend to actively teach that version of God, it's still very easy for you to interpret God through that lens of expectation, of judgment, of fear, and condemnation, and having to appease God and God being fundamentally oppressive. Is that what God's actually like? Or is that just how I've learned to relate to him? And if that's how my psychology is viewing God, then I'm actually experiencing God that way. But you don't have to. I've been told that I have a generous view of God, and that's probably right. I read the Bible with a bias towards God's goodness. I kind of believed that early on in my own journey with God, that the God whom I believed existed has to be good. I believed that God was good. I believed that the world was good by definition, if not, difficult. And I believed that in knowing God better, I was moving towards that same goodness. But then what does goodness mean? What do we mean by good? Well, I believed that something, if God says something, it has to be coming from the best possible place. My own limited notions of good had to be able to learn from his notions of good and be raised up even higher. But if we attribute something to God that is not good, maybe our understanding of that is wrong. Now, some people will use that same logic to adopt biases that actually aren't good, but because their own understanding of God is down here, it's like, oh, God sends people to hell, therefore that must be the highest good. Let's tie ourselves into knots trying to justify this. And it's like, maybe we need to rethink it from both sides. Sometimes it's our own understanding that's limited. Sometimes there is a higher good in things that we initially perceive as negative. But you got to wrestle it out. Some things have been accepted as true doctrine for a really long time. But when you take a closer look, it's like, okay, maybe there's less evidence here than I thought, or some of these ideas have more than one meaning, or these words have more than one meaning. Maybe there's a larger picture to give to this. And what I've learned in a lot of my exegetical studies of the Bible is the Hebrew mind is so much broader than the modern mind. We're very good at left brain activities, at head orientation stuff. But we're talking about an ancient Middle Eastern cultural group whose language and everything we know about them is far more right-brained. It operates on a very different basis. The language itself is not geared towards philosophy and science and those sorts of specific things. It was more geared towards poetry and metaphor and right brain apprehensions of reality that you could come to understand through stories, that you could feel into through poetry, that when you meditate on these things and you allow them to inhabit your heart and you're relating and you're in relationship with God, occupying that generative space, out of your heart comes wisdom. It's like the biblical literature goes in, and in relationship with God, wisdom and insight and maturity comes out. Anyway, we're getting close to the completion of this podcast hour. But there is something I wanted to mention just to kind of wrap up on the notion of God's presence, God's here-ness, God's abiding closeness. There's a notion that we don't chase after God's presence because God's presence is present already. He's not the one who all of a sudden shows up. We are the ones who finally show up. One of the obstacles I've found to this is that we encounter God in our hearts. This is a biblical concept that's all through the Bible, but no one seems to really stop and realize it nowadays. But regardless, we can cover that another time. We encounter God in our hearts, but our hearts are also where we store our unconscious, unresolved trauma. And so many of us, our ego, our own flesh, there's something inside us, a mechanism that keeps us from entering into our hearts, making ourselves vulnerable to the place of our hearts, being present. Because that's also where our traumas are. That's where our anxiety lives. That's where our fears and repressed emotions of anger and jealousy and all that stuff is in the heart, in a manner of speaking. And so when we become vulnerable to our hearts, it's almost like, oh no, I'm going to be overwhelmed by all of these distressing things. So we don't go there. There's a part of us that's beyond our awareness much of the time that keeps us from that place, that's suspicious of that place, that will justify not going there at all. It's too distressing. But it's also the place where we encounter God. And so there's a kind of faith, trust, that we have to take as our safety blanket moving into that place of the heart. We have to trust that whatever distressing thing we may encounter within ourselves, God's closeness, that securing relationship we have with him, is going to go with us as well. That the things that we might encounter and uncover within ourselves that are overwhelming and distressing and things that even we hate about ourselves, that God going with us, he does not condemn us. That God going with us, he does not judge us. The only judgment God has towards us is, you are the one who I decided was worth saving. You are the one whom I love. You are the one I am committing to abide with. You are the one who I believe in to continue on this journey and become who I created you to be. That is God's judgment towards us. You are not an orphan. You are a son. You are a daughter. You belong. That is God's verdict as the judge. Not a condemning message, but a judgment of, you are worthy to be redeemed. If we can hold on to that as a thing that we believe is true, we assert it's true, but may not feel, we can take that into the realm of the heart and use it as a light to dispel the darkness of whatever else we might find there. Some traditions call it the shadow, the things about us that we've unconsciously repressed, things that we don't find acceptable about ourselves. And because we've made it unconscious, we're also unaware when we project those things onto other people. And it causes parts of us to get activated in a way that without us even thinking about it too closely, antagonistic or fearful or people-pleasing behavior towards other people. Now, we're not going to get into all of that this time. leave a comment if there's things about today's episode that you'd like more elaboration on. If you have questions, if you want to engage, please do so in the comment section. But in any case, the thing that I want to leave you with that connects in with this presence is the inheritance of a hired hand has to work for their pay, but a son inherits wealth by virtue of their relationship. Our salvation is a gift as an inheritance. We have it by virtue of our relationship. This secure attachment we have with God, this abiding that God's already doing with us, we just need to realize to do it back with him. This relationship that's edifying and nourishing and helps us work through issues and brokenness and continue our development into who we're meant to be. The inheritance of that is not necessarily that we fight our own battles, although sometimes God will put a sword in our hand and a shield and say, here's the next baddie for you to fight. I've got your back. I believe in you. Now there's that kind of fighting. And there's another kind of fighting where it's us on our own, distressed, feeling outside of relationship and outside of the resources that come with that relationship. That kind of fighting, God says, no. Repent of that whole mindset going forward. Some battles I want to fight for you. Some battles have already been won. You just haven't realized it yet. And so in that sense, the inheritance with which certain battles are avoided entirely, and you receive healing and restoration that was always available to you, is through something the Bible calls rest. Rest, in this sense, is something that we also receive by virtue of relationship. It's the rest of finally coming home. It's the rest of a child who's gone out into the world, into the playground, and they've had their adventure, they've exerted themselves, and now they're tired. Now they're sick, or they're hurt even, and where do they run to? Where do they fall back to as a place to recover, to rest, to get their strength back, to be encouraged and supported? They come back to that relationship. So whenever the Bible talks about rest, it's rest for your soul. It's rest for your being when it falls back to being with God, being with him, rather than, thinking, oh yeah, God is present. I know that. God, thank you for being present. It's like, no. Allow yourself to come home. Allow yourself to come back to this place that God hasn't left. We've forgotten about it. When we make ourselves vulnerable to that place, and we fall back into being with him, that is when we experience rest for our souls. That is the place where we are restored so that we can go back out into the world. We can face the challenges of our own lives. We are renewed to face new challenges. Because first, we rested. It's actually as an aside, 7 days God created the world. God created human beings on the sixth day. The very first thing human beings experienced was rest. You don't work for your rest. You work from your rest. Rest first, be restored in this place of abiding with God, this powerful relationship that you can inhabit. It's a generative space, a reciprocal space. And then from that place, we go out into our lives. That's the idea. Anyway, so I've been talking for a little while now. I want to thank those who've come across this video. I want to thank you for abiding with me and engaging with some of these ideas. I'd love to know your thoughts. I'd love to hear what some of your experiences with these and related concepts have been. Maybe you've heard of attachment theory and you still haven't wrapped your head around it. That's okay. We've got lots of time. I'll be back again same time next week. This has been the Heart Journey Home podcast. And thank you so much for joining me. All the best.